Nearly 2 years after its release, I can proudly say I finally beaten Signalis all the way. During the first ending, a false one in which Elster doesn't find Ariane, I was left with a feeling of emptiness. I couldn't believe all that struggle I endured was for nothing. This wasn't just a bad ending, it was an incomplete one. Then I got COVID and forgot about Signalis for a while, shelving it away in my memory. I didn't think I'd ever play it again. I didn't think I had the nerve to. Then in June of 2024, Sphere Hunter posted her review of Crow Country, a game that in many ways takes inspiration from Signalis' retro survival horror aesthetic. In the video, she references Signalis, going so far as saying she had a religious experience with the game. As cruel as the gameplay can be, Signalis' narrative is unimpeachable in its despair. In my first video, I dared to ask if games should be fun. We've gotten so wrapped up in the escapism they provide, but I often wonder if this escapism has blackpilled us. Not in the plebeian 90s sense that video games are immoral and cause us to become school shooters, but rather in the sense that they have distracted us from thinking too hard about certain topics. I'm not saying that every game needs to be like Signalis, but it is nice that in the independent sphere video games have grown up. This is still a pretty young medium when you think about it. There are so many things that I will never be able to unhear or unsee after playing it. Like the echoing of the replicant's footsteps and how 4th of July fireworks now go off in the same hollowed out cadence in my head. Like a nagging question answering itself in the most dreadful way possible. I remember being outside on the 4th, stun-locked and half expecting a polygonal shaped replicant to shamble my way, finally putting me out of my misery. Or the synthetic colors used to indicate health. Survival horror purists have taken for granted Resident Evil's archetype for health, in which green indicates fine, orange means caution, and red signifies you're on the verge of death. In Signalis, blue indicates your highest level of health, but you're not fine, you're nominal. Fine is defined as high quality or in a satisfactory or pleasing manner. Nominal is defined as existing in name only, because there is no fine when your entire existence is reduced to subhuman. After taking a hit, going into the menu will show Elster's health bar as still blue for a time, before it transitions uncomfortably into a more cautionary shade of yellow. It's like the hit doesn't technically register unless you go seeking it out. Signalis has been praised as a queer love story. I am not a woman nor a lesbian, and yet Signalis has allowed me to understand a little better the struggles of each. The amount of discomfort I experienced just by playing the game is a testament to its design, to its ability to understand human suffering on a level I've been lucky enough to have never experienced in my own life. The environment, mechanics, and aesthetic are cruel because totalitarianism is cruel. It thrives on heteronormativity. Any deviation from it is seen as objectively wrong or other, something incorrect with you or in you that needs to be stamped out. Following rigid laws is a result of living in a civilized society, but maybe that's precisely the cost of having to live in a civilized society, the sacrifice of humanity. There isn't much queer representation in popular media, and while Signalis is by no means a mainstream game, I'm happy it has found as much of an audience as it has. Project 2025 would likely ban the possibility of games like Signalis existing, a far-right program which aims to look in the rearview mirror to take away what little freedoms the oppressed have struggled to earn. The project is ironically touted as a second American Revolution that would make it illegal to be trans, that looks to control women's bodies, to take away perhaps the one good thing that came out of Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher's neoliberalism of the 1980s, the unique individual. Identity should be no one's business but the individual's, and yet there are people with endless amounts of capital and power who can't help themselves to the cruelty of dictating what one should look like or should act like. Project 2025 also looks to eradicate what little of the United States education system remains. Books by LGBTQ+ authors have already been banned in some states. As much as my time with Signalis made me uncomfortable, it allowed me to realize something valuable about my identity. No one can make it for you. I feel so lucky in this regard. I grew up being taught to like normal male things like baseball and sitcoms, but my curiosity, my hunger for seeking out different experiences, drove me to discover strange things like Silent Hill and Resident Evil. I didn't choose to be obscure, I simply followed where my care and passion took me. and weird Japanese survival horror games were a more fascinating alternative than anything conventional Western media had to offer me. Signalis is a deeply personal story, and it has reached someone like me who has spent a lot of his life sheltered. My identity has been shaped by heteronormativity since I was a child. Since I was born, really. Signalis has brutally reminded me that we rarely get what we want out of life, and if I feel that way as a privileged white man, I can only imagine how much more suffering is experienced by people who don't enjoy the same privilege. I am grateful to Signalis and its creators for that. So yeah, on to the final third. Well, kind of. I'm going to give you a lot of history here. Signalis' prosthetic memories don't appear to inspire any hope of revolution. The replicants are already dead, and whatever war happened between Yusan and the Empire has long been over and forgotten. Signalis isn't a game about revolution or war, but rather mourning the failures of the former and the ineptitude of the latter. Replicant memories are doomed to loop well past their period of expiration. And what's truly terrifying is that the reanimated replicas have no idea what they're doing, because they have long forgotten their purpose. Ariane has sent a message to Elster long after either of them have served a function to their country. But Elster has one remaining purpose, one in a post-death decayed society, and it is to find Ariane and put an end to both of their misery. In Nier Automata, you discover late in the game that humanity died off long ago. There's an endless war being waged between two different nations of machines, both of which have forgotten anything but conflict. Fascism and war are related, but they are different causes that rise out of the many contradictions in capitalism. Daniel Guerin defines it in his book Fascism and Big Business as such, quote, "There is certainly a direct link between war and fascism. They grow out of the same dung heap. They are, each in its own way, the monstrous products of the capitalist system in decline. They both flow from the fundamental vice of the system. First, the incompatibility between the tremendous development of the productive forces and private ownership of the means of production. Second, the partitioning of the world into national states." End quote. Fascism is an ideology without an end goal because the end is the means. It is the illogical result of the failure of the human experiment, when an insatiable appetite for the great game of expansion has proliferated to the point that no amount will ever be enough. And it is contingent on liberal democracy's nihilistic belief that endless profit generation is the only justified and moral means to move forward as a society. Indifference towards humanity results. As Hannah Arendt put it in her Origins of Totalitarianism, quote, "They elevated cruelty to a major virtue because it contradicted society's humanitarian and liberal hypocrisy," end quote. Elster becomes aware of her own prosthetic memories during the beginning of Chapter 3, called Gesteizerfrei. She finds a classified document she isn't supposed to read. The memo warns not to remind LSTR units about the war, or to even let them watch movies or listen to music. Immediately after, we find a note from Ariane going into detail about her and Elster's relationship, where Ariane admits they watch war movies and kitschy dramas together. And then we're actually shown a glimpse of Ariane and Elster's relationship. They dance to Franz Schubert's Serenade, but the fairy tale doesn't last for long. We're thrust back to the end of Chapter 2, with Elster alone in the desert, mentally and literally falling apart. Like the replicants in Ridley Scott's Blade Runner, the replicas in Signalis have an expiration date, but she pieces herself together one final time to find Ariane in Rotfront. Rotfront is where, in one sense, Ariane and Elster meet. Ariane was a sensitive soul whose artistic talent was discouraged. Instead, she was forced to work at her family's photo shop. Elster is an imperial spy that the Rotfront media already suspect has arrived. It's unclear what nation Elster serves, but it doesn't really matter for the plot. Despite having different personalities, Ariane exposes Elster to music and films. Rotfront, like Sierpinski, is rife with Yusan propaganda. Like the story of Nier, the nation of Yusan were fighting a never-ending war against an empire that is never named. Although the great nation of Yusan's propaganda suggests it fairly broke off from the iron grip of the empire, it remains an authoritarian entity. Though this is speculation, as the game never outwardly references communism or any real-world historical events, Many memos in the game are dated in the 80s. This could mean the 2080s, the 2180s, but I take it to mean the 1980s, which was the last decade of the Soviet Union's existence. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989. East Germany was reunited with West Germany, and the territory that formerly comprised Russia was reinstated, undergoing a swift and brutal transition into capitalism that left a lot of its citizens destitute as market prices wildly fluctuated. Rotfront, or Rotfront Kampfverbund, isn't just a badass-sounding name Rose Engine used. It was a far-left paramilitary organization in Weimar Germany between the two world wars. They were banned during Hitler's rise to power in the 1930s for obvious reasons. When many people think of a socialist revolution, they probably think of the 1917 Russian overthrow of the monarchy. And history has shown, at least in the West, that it was a catastrophe to liberal democracy. But far less people know about the 1918 German Revolution, in which the country's workers' and soldiers' councils were miraculously able to seize control of the government and the military. If not for the Russian and German revolutions, there would be no 8-hour workday or women's rights to vote. Kaiser Wilhelm II, the last remaining remnant of the German aristocracy, was forced to abdicate. 1918 was a pivotal year for Germany because it was the end of the First World War, a war that had decimated Germany's economy. The November Revolution was a surge of hope for a better future, but unfortunately the resistance was squashed the following year. Germany's Social Democratic Party, the SPD, had become increasingly pro-war over the decades. While it started as a vehemently Marxist party with the goal of a workers' revolution, it slowly compromised its goal of revolution, realigning itself with parliamentary democracy in order to become more mainstream. Concessions were made by the far left to allow the centrist SPD to run things after the workers' revolution in November. Friedrich Ebert, a staunch counter-revolutionary, was the head of the party. The Spartacists were born out of a split within the SPD, led in spirit by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg. They rebranded themselves the KPD, or Communist Democratic Party. Had the Spartacists defeated the SPD, we could very well be looking at an entirely new world. But while the 20s looked to be a time of hope and change in the country, both Rosa and Karl would be dead before the decade began. The Freikorps, a far-right paramilitary sect, was responsible for theirs and many other Spartacist deaths. The Freikorps were the predecessors to Hitler's stormtroopers, a unit comprised of disillusioned German soldiers. Suffering and loneliness can be exploited when one feels as though they no longer have a home, so they look to mythology. Fascism is predicated on a myth of a returning to something that once was. It harvests nostalgia, itself the most unreliable of narrators. The German far right weaponized the fear and resentment of the Freikorps, able to convert many German workers who had been traumatized by the psychological and economic toll left by the war. The SPD, which claimed to be revolutionary only in word, harbored a quiet alliance with the German far right, whom they saw as less dangerous than the radical Spartacist movement. Regretfully, it was a stroke of genius by the far right, who eventually came to be known as the National Socialist Party, to portray the Spartacists as scapegoats responsible for the miserable condition Germany was now in. The country had deteriorated not because of reckless imperialism and neglect of its people, but because of socialists and Jews. This resentment and scapegoating allowed the National Socialists to legally acquire more seats in the government, until Hitler acquired power legally by the 1930s. And it is very important to remember here that Hitler was patient, able to acquire power legally through legislation. Sound familiar? Rose Engine haven't gone into great detail in interviews, but they are from Hamburg, Germany, which was part of the Western Bloc after World War II. It is my belief that USAN is a stand-in for East Germany, which was a satellite state of the USSR. Decades of Western propaganda from media outlets from even the left-leaning New York Times painted a, let's just call it, unsavory view of the USSR. East Germany was portrayed as an isolated authoritarian state, but the Berlin Wall was essential in keeping out Western imperialism. Through the propaganda machine, a false consciousness was created in the West, especially in my native United States, a country which viewed things like workers' rights or suspicion of privately owned enterprises as something evil that needed to be eliminated.
The press often, by the way, is just the purveyor of this. You know, the leaders get up and they say, this is happening, that's happening, the Reds are there, the red bear's at the gate and all that, and the press dutifully and uncritically reports that. and so they've got whatever is the new line. The people didn't suddenly just get up and clamor for a red witch hunt. The people didn't suddenly just get up and say, oh, let's arrest all the trade union leaders in 1919. There was no mass demonstrations of the people saying, get the Reds out from among us. The people didn't call for the return of Cold War II. The American people didn't call for an increase in military spending and the cuts in the human services. That was something that was done from the top down.
And it's safe to say the West did a remarkable job in this regard, as unions have become rather pithy in their relevance. A vast majority of American workers, while deeply unhappy with their jobs and future job security, will still probably scoff at anything other than working just hard enough to earn job security. And most will have to abandon plans of retirement in order to keep themselves secure. When I first played Signalis, I believed Yusan to be fascistic, but I no longer think that. Authoritarian doesn't mean fascist. I think the US media would like to believe that to be the case, though. Despite being viewed as a backward third world country, the USSR allowed its male citizens to not only retire at the age of 60, but give them an option to continue working if they felt so inclined. And get this, women got to retire at 55. The winners get to determine history, and it is pretty much a given that the United States and the West were the great winners of World War II. But the reality remains that the war was won by the grit and determination of the Soviets, who defended their land from a Nazi invasion. In fact, Nazi Germany modeled the invasion of the Soviet Union after the Proto-American colonizers' invasion of indigenous peoples who originally inhabited the territory. But American history doesn't like to tell that side of the story. Look, I get it. This shit is complicated. It is true that the Soviet Union was authoritarian, but it is also true that literacy greatly increased and the price of food remained stable there for decades. It's almost like concepts like good and evil are simplistic binaries designed to manipulate people into believing life is simpler than it actually is, when the reality is that there is an overlap of good and evil pretty much everywhere throughout time. So to judge things as this way or the other way is to eliminate nuance, which is what an empire wants from its citizens more than anything. The philosopher Georg Wilhelm Hegel called this remedial understanding of history sense certainty. The difference between the USSR and Germany was industrialization. The Soviet Union was the first country to have a socialist revolution, but they lacked Germany's technological prowess. Germany had the tools to be the first fully industrialized socialist country, but the Bolsheviks and the Spartacists could not find enough common ground to forge an alliance, as Rosa Luxemburg's critique of the Bolshevik Party and Karl Leibniz's aggressive personality led to more hostility than a genuine looking inward. Fascism masquerades as a revolutionary movement. There is a certain postmodern irony in what the Nazis were able to do nearly a century ago. They were able to bastardize socialism into fascism by promising the dispossessed, which was all of Germany's working class, that there would be socialism. Just not the type of socialism that favored the worker. Today's far right would never dare use the word socialism, as it has become a boogeyman, but the sentiment remains. We never find out who the great dictator is in Signalis. All we know is that the Falk units are modeled in her image, simulated copies designed to keep things in check. The Falk's eyes are the security cameras that watch your every move, the true omnipotence of an authoritarian regime, which is a clear homage to the Stasi. The Stasi functioned as East Germany's version of the KGB. And yeah, KGB and Stasi bad, but also let's not forget that both of these secret police were direct responses to fighting America's own CIA. The Falk each have their own replica who handle all the menial tasks like paperwork. These units are administrators who not only obsessively worship the Falk, but dutifully carry out their every order. There is one man in Signalis, Adler. He wants nothing more than to prevent Elster from reuniting with Ariane. During your first encounter, he pushes Elster down an elevator shaft. Elster survives the fall by landing on all the copies of her who have died in previous cycles. Adler isn't a boss in Signalis, nor is he a charismatic villain. He's a bureaucratic dweeb. The most remarkable thing about him is his banality, and it was, I think, the right design choice by Rose Engine to not have his boss battle included. He's the most tragic result of men who have given up the fight to authoritarianism, weak and impotent, but also predictable and cliché. Elster's prosthetic memories have been implanted into the Falks, causing her to go insane and leaving Adler without a purpose, which explains his obsession with stopping Elster. Adler's relationship with his Falk unit is codependent to the point that he has lost all meaning without her, deteriorating into a shell of a man without any function except to stop Elster. But the Falk is the final boss of the game, and she bears a striking resemblance to Ariane, except with brunette hair. The Falk tells Elster it's pointless to fight her, that there's nothing to be gained from returning. The entire third of Rotfront focuses on an astronomy puzzle in the section's main hub. Elster must find 6 tarot cards and place them into the corresponding slots. The use of tarot and astrology is an interesting design choice for the developers. It is looked upon now as a pseudoscience by the more empirical, rational, and enlightened branches of science, and I'm putting hard finger quotes on that sentence. But astrology was taken as seriously as, if not more so, than the other sciences prior to the Enlightenment. All the cards in the puzzle correspond to a location in Signalis' game world, which are all based on either real-world locations or fictional lost cities. There are 6 you must find. 6 is an important number in Signalis' universe. Yuri Stern gives the simple reason for why this is: only take what you absolutely need. But here at the end of the game, the number 6 takes on its spiritual meaning, which, no, isn't the mark of the devil, but rather a sign to reflect. All the cards used belong to the major arcana. For example, the Tower card represents sudden change, a collapse of one's ego leading to an uncertain future. For Elster, it is the realization that she is about to encounter her fate. Astrology, like religion, requires a certain amount of faith, a trust that your destiny is already determined, you just have to understand what the cards are telling you. Finding all the tarot cards gives Elster a diagram by which to solve the moon puzzle in Rotfront's main hub. Solving it allows Elster to astrally jump to the beginning of the game, where she first encounters the King in Yellow. I haven't mentioned the King in Yellow because 1, I haven't read it fully, and 2, there are already plenty of creators who have already explained its significance in great detail. But it was the written word that caused Adler to go insane, to slowly deteriorate without a leader to serve. So now he can only block Elster and Ariane's fate. After Elster defeats the Falk, Adler stands between Elster and the crashed ship, this time without his human face. He stabs Elster in the eye and she shoots him dead. We're finally inside. There are notes from Ariane dispersed throughout, chronicling a number of her cycles on the crashed ship. She doesn't appear too passionate about Elster in these entries. Ariane just wanted to get away from Rotfront, to distract herself from the paranoia of a crumbling nation. But she crash-landed, living past the 3,000 cycles, forgetting about Elster. There are 4 endings to Signalis depending on how you play the game. I got the memory ending, which requires the player to take their time, seeking out as many item descriptions and memos as possible. It's almost like if you take your time, the more faded Ariane's memories become. I don't know if the memos read differently if you get the promise ending, nor do I care to seek it out. I'm left with my perfectly imperfect ending, a cruel reminder that time passes, memory withers away, and the agony of existing increases with an awareness that maybe hope isn't always worth clinging to. When I originally had the idea to do this video, there was one thing I wanted to talk about, but the more and more these videos became a reality, I just shied away from wanting to talk about it. So here I am now talking about it. In the middle of editing these, Erich posted this on Twitter, comparing present-day America, the richest nation in the world, and the current global hegemony with Weimar Germany, a defeated, burned-out shell of a nation, is so ahistoric and internet brain that it should be immediately disqualifying. Nobody hates modern America like conservatives. I definitely agree with this, but what I want to talk about here isn't history. I've already given you history, and I don't even know if I would call the United States fascistic. I watched a TikTok where somebody said, America isn't a democracy with a fascist problem. America is a fascist country with a democracy problem. Whether you agree with that or not I'll leave that up to your interpretation. But I wanted to talk about this but I wanted to talk about it in the sense of my identity as an American. In 2016, I was so resentful. I was working a job I hated, and I had an addiction to painkillers. And I remember coming home from a long day at work and watching the 2016 presidential election, which I thought, I was so apolitical at the time that I forgot the election was even happening, really. Like, I didn't really care. But then as I was watching it, I was secretly hoping Donald Trump would win. And the only like explanation I can give is that I was just kind of like in this kind of like edgelord Joker wanting to watch the world burn type of mentality. Like, I wasn't an incel. I was dating my girlfriend, now wife at the time. But at that time, the most important thing to me was when and where I was going to get my next high. Then I was told close to the 2020 election, a friend I have from New York joked to me that I was acting like a boomer because I was complaining about having to do menial yard work like raking the leaves and cutting the grass. I live in a suburban, middle-class, affluent neighborhood. And though she was joking, her comment really triggered me because it made me feel like my identity was unremarkable. And that was completely the opposite of how I wanted people to perceive me. And I had changed since 2016. I'd become more political and I had kicked my opiate addiction. But still, my intentions about my identity and my politics were kind of conflicted and messy. Then in October of 2022, Signalis released. And I remember playing it for a few hours and it leaving quite an impression on me. Me and my wife were invited to a Halloween party, which was mostly comprising of her friends, her family, and State Center was even there, like political type of people. And I had this idea that I go as a prostitute and she go as a pimp. And it was kind of a joke to me because she was the sole breadwinner, and in many ways still is. But then I realized it wasn't really a joke to me. I was taking this costume as seriously as I've taken anything in my life. Like, the week leading up to the party, I was going over in my head and what outfit I was going to wear, and I kept changing it every day. And then the day of, my wife spent all day working on my makeup. God bless her. I even shaved my beard, and I cringed when I looked in the mirror because I looked more like my mom. At the party, everyone was shocked. My cousin thought I was conservative. Could you imagine watching this video and thinking I'm conservative? So at the party, the state senator comes up to me. I promise my life is rarely this interesting. And he remarked on my feet. He said like the costume was pretty well done overall, but there were a couple of blemishes. First of all, I didn't get a pedicure and there were hair on my feet, like, because I painted my toenails and I was wearing these kind of like Gucci white flip-flops. And then he commented on my chest hair, and I kind of just like said, yeah, it's just a costume. It's not something, like I could have went all the way. But I remember that making me feel uncomfortable, and I felt objectified. For the first time in my life, and probably the only time, I felt like a woman. And it was a very interesting feeling. Then I posted pics of the outfit on Instagram. And I remember when I did this, I was simultaneously terrified and thrilled. My mom saw it and she said I looked ugly for a woman, which I thought was interesting because, like I said, I looked like a spitting image of her in the mirror. And I noticed a lot of my friends, like my main friend group, who were mostly straight dudes like me, didn't like the post. And I remember feeling like a lot of anger and resentment towards that. And like, I wondered, why didn't they like it? Were they confused? Did they think I was like seeking attention? Maybe jealousy? Was it indifference? Did they just not see it? I don't know. And this pertains to Signalis because If I had never played Signalis, I don't think I would have ever really sought out a question I had. Like, I genuinely began to wonder, do I have gender dysphoria? And the answer is no, I don't. But it took that experience on Halloween to realize that. And it forced me to check my intentions. Maybe it was guilt over how I felt in 2016. Maybe it was guilt about, growing up privileged in a middle-class neighborhood. But here's the thing. Look at me. I'm wearing a backwards baseball hat. I have a beard. This is my mask. This is my identity, whether I want it to be or not. This is how people perceive me. And this is how I am comfortable being perceived. And that's why I know I don't have gender dysphoria. Attention is something I act like I don't want. I can come across pretty shy in social situations. I'm envious of people who are able to tell stories to other people in social situations, because I feel like I want to do that more than anything. And I get caught in my own head whenever I try to do it, unless I've been drinking alcohol. But then I remember watching a ContraPoints video one time, and she said that YouTube favors the introvert, but not only the introvert, but the introvert that wants attention. And I'm pretty sure it was in that moment that I realized what I wanted to do for the rest of my life, whether I'm a horrific failure at it or not. I do want to be a YouTuber, as cringy as that sounds to say out loud. And the best way I can be an ally to minorities, whether that be Black people, trans people, queer, whatever, is to be this version of myself. It's not pretending to be somebody I'm not for likes on social media or clout or whatever fucked up narcissistic reason I used to have. It's just to be this unremarkable straight dude talking to you right now. Signalis is a game that it has changed me, and it's made me realize all of these things. And yeah, if you made it this far, thank you so much for watching.